Many people associate the name Javier Milei with that of the libertarian, an intellectual who revolutionized Argentine politics, the father of the social and cultural movement, who, with the forces of heaven, is transforming the economic and political model into one of free market and individual liberties, while others see in the sharp-eyed man from Buenos Aires an authentic con artist with psychological problems, a populist of the libertarian right who is impoverishing the majority of Argentines. How did Javier Milei, after living such a complicated childhood, manage to become an icon of world culture? This is Reynaldo Carrillo Vilches speaking, and join me to learn the story of the man who is today the top leader of Argentina. In Argentina, immersed in military coups, he was born on October 22, 1970 in the Palermo neighborhood, Javier Gerardo Milei, in the harsh intimacy of a lower middle-class home marked by family tensions. His father, Norberto Horacio Milei, was a man shaped by the culture of manual labor, a public transport driver who would, over the years, rise turbulently into the business world. His mother, Alicia Luján. She would remain on the domestic side in a role often described as distant, passive, and at times eccentric. Over time, the family moved to areas like Villa Devoto and Sáenz Peña, following the economic rise that Milei's father was experiencing. Multiple accounts, including those of Milei himself, agree in describing his family environment as one marked by physical and psychological abuse. In interviews, biographies, and journalistic reconstructions describe a father who was authoritarian, with an explosive temper, who used violence as a usual form of punishment, and a mother who, far from intervening, would withdraw in an attitude that Milei himself would later characterize as passive complicity. In fact, in some statements, Milei claims that for him, his parents are dead, although later, as a result of his entry into politics and other events, he would partially reconcile with them. One of the most revealing episodes happened in 1982 during the Falklands War, when Javier, at just 12 years old, made an observation during a family meal, in which, according to him, he predicted Argentina's defeat in the war due to the superiority of the British troops. His father reacts furiously to the comment. He chases him around the house, physically assaults him, and almost breaks his face. And that's not all. His younger sister, a very important figure in Argentina today named Karina Milei, suffers a nervous breakdown because of this, which requires hospitalization. And his mother, instead of comforting him, blames him for everything that happened. This kind of event undoubtedly marks his childhood. The early education of young Javier Milei takes place at Cardinal Copel School in Villa Devoto, a Catholic institution that Javier Milei will remember with bitterness in the future, associating the dogmatic rigidities that marked his distancing from the Catholic religion. A break that over the years will become explicit and controversial, as has happened in many episodes of Argentine history between the church and statesmen. For example, when Javier Milei as president referred to Pope Francisco as the evil one on earth. Now then, this distancing has not meant an absence of spirituality in Javier Milei, but rather a transformation toward more heterodox beliefs. Milei, for example, has referred to God as number one and has linked his symbolic world to the figure of his deceased dog, Conan, revealing a relationship with the transcendent shaped by his own personal experience. And it is worth mentioning that as he has gotten closer to power, he has shown great sympathy for religions such as Judaism. The truth is that Javier Milei, beyond the early intelligence he showed, just as he had a problematic life with his family, would also have it at school and in his social life. From a very young age, the nickname the Crazy One became popular, and according to various testimonies, it didn't just come from his behavior, but also from the way his own father would call him that in public to humiliate and bother him. His classmates described the young Milei as someone who was irate, solitary, and prone to verbal outbursts. Frequently on the verge of physical confrontation, the school, which for many represented a place for friendships, became for Javier Milei a place of stress, loneliness, and a lot of anger. The emotional world of the young Milei was reduced to two figures: his maternal grandmother, who was his emotional support, and his sister Karina, who emerged as the only companion in his life. His sister Karina became his refuge. They were very close. This emotional closeness would last into adulthood, with his sister taking on a central role in decision-making for his movement and his actions. A peculiar relationship that has sparked all kinds of strange comments, such as when Milei said that if he became president of the republic, his sister would be the first lady of Argentina. In parallel to this hostile environment, he finds a space that allows him to express his talents and abilities much better. With the Argentine passion for soccer, since he was 12 or 13 years old, young Milei has played as a goalkeeper in the youth divisions of Chacarita Juniors. His teammates remember his style as risky, almost reckless, with impulsive moves, constant shouting, and an uncommon intensity, showing both stress and overall talent on the field as a player. He was also known at that time for another side of himself that allowed him to express his identity as someone who was very fond of rock music, even creating his own band called Evening. They composed songs that came to be described as porno rock because of the explicit content of their lyrics. Now, a lot of this is going to change in 1989. That year, Raúl Alfonsin's Argentina went through one of the deepest economic crises in its recent history, a severe hyperinflation that especially affected the most humble Argentinians. Prices skyrocket, wages lose value in a matter of days, uncertainty is absolute, and money is worth less and less. For Milei, this phenomenon will be a formative experience. What interest will arise in Milei from major economic and political events and their relationship with everyday phenomena, such as supermarkets, people's purchasing power, and the supply and demand for jobs, and other matters that deeply attract his attention, and more than that, will become his life's calling. So that's how Milei gradually leaves behind his youthful interests and embraces what will become his true destiny, the study of history, economics, and the dissemination of his ideas about it. Milei doesn't seem to see this new vocation as just a simple choice of study, but as something existential and urgent. He wants to understand where inflation and the loss of currency value come from, something that, according to him, would become an obsession. He sees economics as a tool to solve all the chaos that Argentina was experiencing. So in 1988 or 1989, he enters the economics degree program. The University of Belgrano marked his transition to university life, but it didn't mean that Milei integrated socially into a broader social life. On the contrary, his isolation would deepen. He doesn't participate in student centers, he's not politically active, and he doesn't take part in traditional academic networks or other types of organizations. His connection to the university is instrumental, serving strictly as a place to study where he has no social relationships, and even less emotional ones. It's worth mentioning that academic records show outstanding performance. He graduates in 1993 with a grade point average of 9.431, of the highest at the time. Is this fact relevant? He was not an erratic student, as was said at some point in some media. On the contrary, his time at the university reveals his intellectual ability. It is worth mentioning that his university life continued to take place in a more than complicated family environment. His father continued to exert psychological pressure on him during these years, and we're not talking about pressure to make him excel. On the contrary, according to the testimony during exam periods, for example, it seemed he was actually pressuring Javier to fail these evaluations. In the final stretch of his studies, he chose to stop his financial support. But Javier Milei managed to finish his studies, thanks to his own savings and an internship at the Central Bank of the Republic, an institution that ironically years later he would propose to eliminate. From an intellectual point of view, Javier Milei's initial education did not align with liberalism or libertarianism. Verbal and radical, which he has professed throughout much of his career. During his university years, Milei actually identified more with center-left movements, particularly with the so-called post-Keynesianism and extracurricularism. These are movements that, for example, consider inflation to be a multi-causal phenomenon and believe that the state should play an active role in regulating the economy. And just as economics remained his intellectual and emotional field and refuge, social and emotional isolation also persisted. The archetype of the misunderstood genius who develops a rejection of the system, as more than a few thinkers would say, that rejection of paternal authority, also translated into a rejection of the concept of the state and into a personal problem with authority, which translated into a confrontational energy against the status quo of Argentina and the world. And it was manifested fundamentally through his economic and political narrative against that status quo. When Milei graduates, he continues his education with postgraduate studies at institutions such as the Institute of Economic and Social Development and the Torquato di Tella University, consolidating his academic training.
Shortly after graduating, he works as an advisor to General Antonio Buzzi,
who had been elected as a national deputy after his past as governor during the so-called national reorganization process governments. Milei collaborates in drafting projects related to the regional economy of Tucumán, particularly in sectors such as sugar and limon. There is no record of active political participation. This information was not public or disclosed until 2021. In response, Milei defended himself by saying that General Antonio Buzzi had been democratically elected and that advising him on technical economic matters did not mean validating his past or political history. Javier advances his career in the heart of the economic instability of those years in Argentina. Between 1996 and 2002, he worked at Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, Argentina, where he experiences the 2001 crisis up close and reinforces his obsession with monetary stability. Then he becomes chief economist at Máxima Administradora de Fondos de Jubilaciones y Pensiones, and in 2004 at the Broda firm, consolidating a technical profile in these economic agencies. And from that same year, he began his teaching career at the University of Buenos Aires, the Argentine University of Business, and the University of Belgrano, with a rigorous approach but marked by conflicts due to his irascible character, which even led to his eventual departure or dismissal from the Argentine University of Business.
Entre el año 2004.
And in 2007, he was at the center of one of the many paradoxes that mark the adventure of his life, when he dedicated himself to advising the Argentine state in litigation before the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, dedicating himself to defending the Argentine state against foreign companies and to defending its preeminent role and authority above others in the Argentine economy. In 2008, he began a key stage by joining Corporation America, the conglomerate of Eduardo Urnequian, one of the richest men in Argentina, who allegedly financed Milei's political project from its beginnings up to the present. There, Milei worked as an executive in the investment risk area for more than a decade. This role allowed him to gain a global perspective on markets, regulations, and the relationships between the public and private sectors. In international spheres of influence, such as the International Chamber of Commerce, this position reinforces another structural tension. He worked for a business group whose activities depended largely on government state concessions. Meanwhile, in his thinking and in his studies, his awareness was evolving more and more toward a radical rejection of interventionism and the participation of the state and government in the economy. His intellectual evolution was beginning to take a more defined direction. If during his university years he had identified with neoclassical and post-Keynesian schools of thought, by the end of the decade, he began to lean progressively toward the Austrian school. From that school, where figures like Friedrich von Hayek and Ludwig von Mises stood out, the turning point came in 2013, when his relationship with a colleague named Diego Giacomini systematically focused on the works of Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard. This is not going to be a merely theoretical shift. It will be an almost existential change for him that will profoundly reshape his worldview. His view of how human relationships worked, human systems and political, economic, social systems, and so on. The state ceases to be, for him, an imperfect but necessary institution. Becoming the main enemy and agent of economic and moral distortion in human development. Between 2010 and 2015, this transformation begins to be reflected in his written work. He publishes articles in media outlets such as La Nación, El Cronista, and Infobae, where he increasingly criticized the economic policies of Kirchnerism. In 2014, he releases Economic Policy Against the Clock, a work that summarized his diagnosis of the Argentine crisis and proposed a program of liberal reforms. So, the experiences he lived since childhood and the crises he went through due to his contact with state and regulatory institutions added to his growing frustration. Watching the development of the Argentine economy, are they going to shape that unique character who today continues and will continue to give people a lot to talk about? His first appearances around 2014 were discreet, almost invisible to the general public. Technical interviews, book presentations, appearances where the figure of the economist still predominated. In April 2014, he made his debut on national television, on the show Horrorclave, where he appears as another specialist with an emphatic but still restrained and moderate speech. He was yet to become the phenomenon. The turning point comes in July 2016, when he is invited to the show Animales Sueltos. That night, he bursts into the studio with great vehemence. His body language, his raised tone, his intense gaze, and his wild hairstyle immediately create an image that's impossible not to recognize. He didn't speak like a traditional economist, but like someone outraged who was fighting. There was an appearance that was hypnotic for many, especially for young people, and it sparked conversation in Argentina. Television finds in him a perfect resource and tool. In an industry that is constantly seeking ratings and attention, Milei offered madness and spectacle. For some, he was an exaggerator with theatrical gifts, but his anger was sincere. He would shout in television studios, but he also knew how to translate his arguments into popular language, showing himself with his outbursts as a rebel of cinema. He defended himself in an environment that would be hostile toward him. And that image, in addition to being a warrior for the problems of the common citizen, combined with that television spectacle, became his main strength. His advisors taught him that television is not a space for deliberation, but for impact. You have to make a splash, a knockout in the first few minutes. Milei starts appearing more and more on television, and his interventions begin to be structured as follows: a strong idea, an incendiary phrase, and a direct confrontation. All of this is wrapped in his unique theatrics. The economic content was compressed into phrases that could easily circulate and be understood not only on all social networks, but also by the masses in general. Other shows started bringing him in as a recurring panelist, where he honed his aggressive style, interruptions, dismissals, extreme metaphors, and that didactic drive, the habit of explaining problems. He popularized the word casta to refer to the entire political class, regardless of their leanings. He associated all of them with a kind of parasitic elite that went against the productive and hardworking people. Milei thus burst onto the scene in an Argentine context marked by precariousness, inflation, and distrust in the entire political and institutional system. His messy hairstyle, rock and roll music, and defiant tone broke the political solemnity and connected with young people who felt excluded and especially frustrated in that Argentine system. But of course, the appeal went further, attracting different sectors from all tendencies who identified with that supposedly anti-system streak, managing to identify especially with groups associated with the so-called New Right. It was also a markedly anti-socialist, anti-communist, anti-left, and anti-statist discourse in favor of capitalism, individual freedoms, and the so-called free enterprise and free competition. Interestingly, just like Juan Domingo Perón in his time, Milei builds a central antagonism of the people against the caste, or the people against the oligarchy. However, unlike Peronism, his proposal did not revolve around the central role of the state in national life, but rather its drastic reduction. Among other differences, it could be said that it was not a nationalist populism like Perón's, but rather a liberal populism, using all the tools and rhetoric that many academics associate with what they call populism to promote radically liberal ideas and an anti-statist program. The events and the quarantine of 2022 accelerated this process of acceleration and eruption in Argentine public opinion. The lockdown and the social crisis paved the way for Milei to intensify his presence on social media, with short videos, controversial phrases, and heated debates, and, in addition, getting into and adapting well to what was then a new logic, which was that of short videos on TikTok, Instagram, and other platforms. There are many people in the comments on his content who tell him to run for president, to start a political movement, and to go beyond just criticism. And the truth is, this was something that not only Milei, but also those who financed and sponsored him from the beginning, among other figures, had already had in mind for some time. So his speech, which had always been one of external and sometimes even extreme criticism, now begins to take on a more constructive tone. It was no longer just about denouncing the establishment, but about replacing it. In 2021, he launched his candidacy for national deputy for the autonomous city of Buenos Aires. The news caused a lot of excitement and also marked the consolidation of the movement known as La Libertad Avanza. The campaign was essentially an extension of his media strategy: short events, viral phrases, and a strong presence on social media. The results surprised a large part of the political system. With approximately 17% of the votes, Milei wins a seat in the Argentine Congress. It wasn't a majority victory, but it was symbolically very significant, especially for the traditional parties, which until then did nothing but mock him, an economist with no solid party structure, built in television studios and on digital platforms. He had not only burst onto the scene, but had also entered parliament and institutional politics. And indeed, from that point on, his party and movement continued to grow exponentially, even while being underestimated by a large part of the Argentine political class. And after this rapid rise, Javier Milei runs for president of the Argentine Republic. His campaign in 2023 does not follow the usual paths of Argentine politics. There were no large territorial deployments, nor big and complex party and electoral structures spread across each province, nor a classic machinery of political activism. Although there was a fundamental and minimal level of organization and structuring, what defines his campaign? It is a strong emotional current that had already been brewing on the margins of the system and finds in his figure a channel for expression. At the beginning, Milei bets on a fully national strategy, largely neglecting provincial disputes and focusing his energy on the presidential race. His message was direct, without nuances, a visceral denunciation against the political caste and a promise of a radical break with the established order. Dollarization, the closure of the central bank of the Argentine Republic, and the famous chainsaw to public spending were not just simple proposals, but attractive and contagious propaganda tools that condensed social unrest. Milei didn't hold the typical rallies of parties in Argentina. Instead, he set up almost theatrical stages. The chainsaw on stage, the music, the dancing, the symbolic destruction of the central bank represented by a piñata, even his provocative references, all created a disruptive effect. Every gesture, every word, every speech was aimed at being clipped, shared, and going viral on social media. Television amplified the impact, and social media turned it into a generational phenomenon. The first major turning point came on August 13, 2023, during the primary, open, simultaneous, and mandatory elections. Against all odds, Milei received 29.8% of the votes and became the most voted individual candidate, surprising everyone and causing a sensation with that victory in 16 districts. He surpassed the two major coalitions, the one led by Mauricio Macri, Together for Change, and the one led by the Kirchnerist government, Union for the Homeland. That night, Milei proved that he was not just a media phenomenon with electoral luck, but a true national political force on the rise. Now, the general elections on October 22 had a nuance to this. Milei loses momentum, getting 29.98% and coming in second place behind Sergio Massa, who gets 36.7% of the votes. The political system, which had been shaken at first, still showed its ability to respond. The election would be decided in a runoff, with Milei facing the greatest challenge of his history. At this moment, the person who had always maintained a radical identity and discourse made a pragmatic shift. As has been seen many other times in history, the candidate who had built his identity on anti-establishment purity found himself needing to broaden his support base through agreements and concessions with sectors of traditional politics. So an alliance was formed with key figures from Juntos por el Cambio, including Patricia Bullrich and Macri himself, a move that was criticized by some of his more orthodox followers, but which proved decisive for the victory. Now, showing moderation in his speech also generates confidence among sectors of power, and this alliance with the center-right electorate consolidates him as a stronger and more viable candidate. Thus, on November 19, 2023, in the runoff, Milei obtained 55.69% of the votes, clearly prevailing over Sergio Massa. He won in 21 out of the 24 districts of the country. The magnitude of the victory reflected the rejection that had accumulated over the years toward the Argentine status quo, which had marked a period of inflation, poverty, economic decline, conflicts, social problems, and persistent frustration. Also, in Argentina, a country where feminism had grown strongly for quite some time, Milei takes positions and stances against radical feminism, which will also earn him significant support. Milei comes to power amid great challenges. Argentina faces serious economic and social problems, and also has an identity and support base built on a narrative of purity and breaking away from the system. However, to have reached the presidency and since the beginning, he has been allied with and sponsored by several members of that same system, which will force him to maintain a difference and a distance between his actions and his rhetoric. On December 10, 2023, Javier Milei crosses the threshold of power with the promise to transform Argentina's economic and political model. It was not a promise of gradualism or transition. He proposes to eliminate the fiscal deficit, stop inflation, stabilize the currency, and lay the foundations for a deregulated economy, in addition to cutting off funding to those he called the parasites of the caste. And what came next was one of the most disruptive and controversial economic experiments in recent Argentine history. Within a matter of weeks, the adjustment program began to take shape. Public spending was drastically reduced by about 35% in real terms. And for the first time in more than a decade, Argentina achieved a sustained fiscal surplus. Under the leadership of Minister Luis Caputo, balancing the public accounts became a principle to uphold above any other social or political demand. According to the government, this policy not only avoided an imminent hyperinflation scenario, but also restored a sense of order in an economy accustomed to excess. And if we look at the data, inflation, which was and still is a constant source of anxiety for Argentinians, started to ease from levels above 25% per month in December 2023. It dropped steadily to around 2.5%, or 3% by the end of 2024. The exchange rate gap is also narrowing. The central bank's reserves are being rebuilt, and in strictly macroeconomic terms, the indicators have been improving. But every process of so-called economic stabilization or economic reforms in general usually comes at a price, and in this case, the price became apparent in Argentina immediately. Despite improvements in things like the fiscal deficit, public spending, and inflation, among others, when Milei comes to power, the Argentine economy enters a recession. The average consumption of Argentinians drops. Numerous small and medium-sized businesses are affected by these changes, and salaries along with pensions and investments were eroded in the first months of the economic adjustment. Poverty in Argentina during that initial period rises to 53%, marking one of the highest peaks since the crisis at the beginning of the 21st century. More than 5 million people in Argentina fall below the poverty line during that process. Macroeconomic stabilization was thus being built on a social reality that was deeply affected and eroded. On the political front, Javier Milei governs under adverse conditions. His political force, which was La Libertad Avanza, has a parliamentary minority, which forces him to move forward through decrees, vetoes, and last-minute negotiations. The so-called Necessity and Urgency Decree 70-02-023, which was his big bet on deregulating the economy, was partially rejected. Meanwhile, the ambitious omnibus law had to be cut back after resistance within the Argentine Congress. Even so, he manages to pass a limited version of the basis law, which includes, among other things, investment incentives and partial reforms. On the streets of Argentina, tension is constant. General strikes, massive demonstrations, and clashes with unions set the tone for the year. Criticism is piling up from different fronts. The opposition denounced the brutal macroeconomic adjustment and an authoritarian populist style of government, while even liberal sectors that supported him were critical. Postponement of key promises such as the dollarization of Argentina, the closure of the central bank, and other economic and political liberalization measures. Nevertheless, in the midst of the Argentine recession, even with the improvement of macroeconomic indicators, and in the midst of the ongoing social and political conflict, Milei maintains positive approval ratings of around 50 to 55% towards the end of 2024. For a significant part of society, it was a process that made sense and aimed at a greater goal. It was the price to avoid a collapse that would later be worse. For another significant sector of Argentina, these measures are intended to save the economic elite, while ordinary people are the ones who pay the cost. Now, in the second year of Javier Milei's government, a decisive turn is marked. The Argentine economy, after hitting rock bottom, begins to expand. It grows by 4.4%. Inflation drops to levels the country hasn't seen in recent years. And millions of Argentinians who had previously fallen into poverty are starting to get out of it, according to statistical indicators. The fiscal surplus, which has already become a dogma of Milei's government, is maintained for the second consecutive year. For Milei, this was not just a short-term goal, but almost a moral principle of the state. Inflation, meanwhile, stabilizes at around 2% per month, while poverty continues to decline from a peak close to 57% to levels around 30%. More than 6 million people statistically emerge from this social vulnerability. The official discourse spoke of normalization, while its critics talked about an uneven recovery, in which most of the population remained in more or less the same state as a few years ago. Meanwhile, those responsible for that crisis were better off than ever. The truth is that Milei's government is also moving forward with what he called second-generation reforms, like the labor flexibilization reform approved in the Senate in February 2026, which seeks to redefine the relationship between capital and labor in the name of competitiveness. The extension, in turn, of the incentive regime for large investments opens the door to foreign capital in strategic sectors such as energy and mining. At the same time, a tax reform aimed at reducing the tax burden is being announced, and there is progressive movement toward lifting currency controls. On the other hand, it's also true that not all promises are being fulfilled, and those that were once denounced as the most unrealistic, such as dollarization and the closure of the central bank, which were central pillars of his campaign, are being postponed indefinitely. Milei doesn't completely abandon them rhetorically, but he starts to redefine them as long-term goals, adapting his speech to the limits of reality. And politically, is his position getting stronger? The victory in the 2025 midterm legislative elections expands his parliamentary base and allows him to negotiate from a less fragile position. Although his political strengthening also involves an increase in conflict, this does not disappear. On the contrary, it remains. And an example of this is the massive protests triggered by labor reforms, as well as general strikes and episodes of police repression, which shows that social reconciliation is far from being an achieved goal during his term. At the same time, during Milei's presidency, there is an issue that bursts into Argentine politics and sparks conversation like never before. President Javier Milei has not only shown and continues to show great affection and admiration for the Jewish religion, but he also breaks with decades of Argentine diplomatic tradition by openly and strongly aligning himself with the State of Israel. His support is both rhetorical and operational, with actions such as moving Argentina's embassy to Jerusalem in 2026, thus recognizing it as the capital of Israel. Against international conventions, at the same time he establishes cooperation agreements in defense and intelligence, and he affirms a clear position in international forums in favor of the State of Israel and its interests in Middle Eastern conflicts. This shift must also be understood in his own personal journey. Since 2021, Milei had begun to publicly embrace Judaism, guided by Rabbi Shimon Axel Banish. He dedicated himself to studying the Torah, visited sacred places, and repeatedly expressed his desire to convert to that religion, a fact that is at least striking in a country with an overwhelming Catholic majority. However, he does not formally complete this conversion until 2026, citing the incompatibility between religious requirements, such as observing the Sabbath and his in-person duties. And these very open and strong demonstrations of support for Israel have certainly sparked internal discussions. From nationalist sectors ranging from Peronism to branches of Catholic nationalism, as well as other sectors of Argentine diplomacy, this alignment has been interpreted as a break with Argentina's sovereign tradition, which has been one of its points of pride for a long time. Several of these sectors point out that such an open alignment is harmful to causes like the loss of support in international forums, for the claim over the Malvinas Islands, and for the negotiation of financing for Argentina. At the same time, they create tensions with key countries in the Arab world and unnecessary exposure to foreign geopolitical conflicts, not to mention other domestic and social policy issues that, according to some, are negatively influenced by this alliance. Israel. According to them, Milei was ideologically redefining the country's international identity, while for his supporters, the alliance with Israel is not only morally correct, as they consider Israel to be the only beacon of civility and democracy in the Middle East, but also, this alliance is favorable for Argentina's commercial, economic, and political relations in the world, due to Israel's level of influence on the planet. According to them, the most pragmatic and sensible thing is to have the best possible relations with that nation. The truth is that from many perspectives, Javier Milei's move, both in terms of geopolitics and domestic policy, has been bold and risky. He has strengthened the relationship with the United States and Israel, positioning Argentina as a clear and key ally of the Western Bloc in Hispanic America. Additionally, within the so-called New Right movements, he is consolidating himself not only as an Argentine icon, but as a global one. Regarding these movements as of today, in 2026, Milei is at the peak of his power, with a recovering economy, an expanded political base, and a narrative of success in the making, but also with strong open tensions, both social, ideological, and geopolitical. Disillusionment even among some of his followers and growing contempt from his enemies. With more questions than answers, the one who is changing the recent history of Argentina.
Muchas gracias a todos por haber visto este video. Les recuerdo que nos dan un gran apoyo dejando sus comentarios, dándole me gusta, suscribiéndose al canal, compartiendo el video con todos sus conocidos y dándole a la campana para activar las notificaciones. Les habló Reinaldo José Carrillo Vilches, esto es La Nueva Enciclopedia. Como siempre les agradecemos por todo su apoyo y muchas bendiciones para todos.